views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
And hello, everyone, and welcome to the Social Justice Forums. I am Daren, Jaime. And of course, people ask the question, what are the Social Justice Forums about? Well, this is the show that talks about the inequities that a lot of people face. We promote civic engagement. We get multiple points of view. We got some very interesting guests who share in-depth discussion on their particular subject matter. We want you to stay with us because we have a very special show, and the Social Justice Forums begins right now. Equality Now is a feminist organization using the law to protect and promote the human rights of all women and girls. Now, they create, they reform, and they challenge and apply the law, establishing enduring equality everywhere. Their global network of lawyers, activists, and supporters hold governments responsible for their international obligation to prohibit all forms of violence and discrimination against women. We're pleased to be having with us as a guest now the legal advisor at Equality Now, Jorie Dugan. And we thank you so much for being with us, Jorie.
Thank you for having me.
And when we talk a little bit about Equality Now, I know the work is really just that, bring about equality. And I want to talk because this month is a very special month. It is a Sexual Assault Awareness Month. But from your perspective, talk to us about sexual assault and where we see it today.
Sure, that's a great question. And yes, we are, April is Sexual Assault Month, and sexual assault is a form of sexual violence. And at Equality Now, one of our major pieces of work and area that we work in is to end sexual violence. And, you know, one of the major data points is that globally, the data shows that 1 in 3 women will experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime, regardless of age, regardless of background, or regardless of country. So talking about sexual violence and being aware of the particular places we are in the world today when it comes to the laws around sexual violence and the barriers to justice around sexual violence is really critical because it remains a major problem all throughout the world.
And when we talk about it going on throughout the world, many times there are a blind eye to this, simply because many people just do that. They turn a blind eye. They're not paying attention to what's going on. But when we look at sexual violence, you've got boots on the ground. Talk to us about what we're seeing and what we're seeing an increased rise of.
Great question. So Equality Now, we have boots on the ground in every hemisphere of the world. We work with global partners who work on the ground. We know that they are the best suited to see the changes that need to be made and how the changes should be made. And one of the big parts of our work is we take what we're hearing from the ground and look at the laws in specific regions and identify what changes need to be made and how the changes need to be made. And as you said, we are identifying particular changes that need to be made globally and regionally. And Equality Now recently published a report looking specifically at the Americas region, and we reviewed laws in 43 jurisdictions and in 35 countries in North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. And we were able to identify particular barriers that were common throughout that region, but we also know that these are barriers to survivors of sexual violence all over the world. So the top 3 barriers to justice that we're seeing through our work includes the rape definitions in countries themselves, statute of limitations, and the way the law treats adolescent girls. So if you permit me, I would love to kind of briefly touch on each 3 of these main barriers.
Absolutely. I want to talk about rape because I think that's something that that definition has seen a lot of movement. And we know that you've done some work internationally. Talk to us, because how rape is viewed in America is not how rape is viewed in other countries.
It's very true. So, you know, one of the things that we've noticed in the US and all of the Americas region and really all over the world, there are so many rape laws that are still rooted in the idea that rape is an act of violence that involves physical force. So we see countries around the world having definitions of rape that are based on force or the threat of force, as opposed to the lack of consent. And we know that a narrow definition of rape, for example, sexual intercourse committed by force, is just a very narrow view, and in fact leaves many sexual acts unpunished, and it leaves, unfortunately, many victims unprotected simply because of the reality and diversity of what sexual violence can actually look like. So our recommendation around rape definitions is to be aligned with international law. And international law prescribes that legal definitions of rape and sexual assault should be centered around individuals' consent to participate in the sexual act. So a sexual act committed without a person's consent. And, human rights law in particular also conceives of the fact that when you assess consent, it must be assessed in the context of surrounding circumstances, because it's critical to realize that often consent cannot necessarily be given voluntarily, genuinely, or willingly in coercive circumstances, such as the exploitation of power dynamics or positions of authority or vulnerability and trust and dependence. So we're seeing a big barrier when it comes to how rape definitions in the US and around the world are actually formulated. So the actual text of the law poses a barrier to survivors.
Yeah. And when we talk about this in the issue of rape and sexual violence, we know that we're still at the end where hopefully we're coming out of the end of the worst of COVID. And talking to people, they said throughout COVID, because people are connected, whether it's domestically or internationally, and a lot of people have been forced to stay home, we've seen increased amounts of cases of that. Is that true?
Exactly right. Yeah. So, COVID, and we're still in the pandemic. So it's really had, we would say it's highlighted a lot of the discriminatory problems that already existed for women and girls when it comes to violence against women, and really just exacerbated those many complex factors. And as you said, it rendered many women and girls all over the world more vulnerable to incidences of sexual violence, domestic violence, sexual exploitation. We saw, more girls being, vulnerable to child marriage even. And it does in part go down to, for example, the lockdowns that we had. It cut survivors and people off from accessing supportive services that they may need even for preventive measures. And in many cases, lockdowns also increase the risk of domestic violence and sexual violence in the home or wherever you were locked down. And service providers themselves found it difficult, right, to continue to work and provide support to the communities. And unfortunately, on the governmental level, where we really try to push to hold government to account to their responsibilities, we unfortunately saw and continue to see a deprioritization of sexual violence cases, whether it's through what the government chooses to fund in terms of supportive and preventive measures, but also the cases that they pursue in terms of justice measures.
We talked about 3 areas. We talked about rape being one of them. Go ahead into your second area.
Sure. So another barrier is statute of limitations. So a statute of limitations is a law that sets the amount of time, it's normally in years, that a victim has to come forward to report a crime for, prosecution or a civil matter, if that's what they choose. And we see that short statutes of limitations actually place an overwhelming burden on victims, because as we know, trauma takes time. And, whether it's because of trauma or stigma, sometimes a continued threat of violence or lack of community support, or sometimes when, violence may have happened to someone as a minor, it can take additional time to process what has happened. So there are many factors that prevent victims from reporting a crime or delay reporting. So human rights activists and legal experts in international law really recommend that when it comes to statute of limitations, there should be no limitation when it comes to sexual violence crime, both for adults and child victims, simply because of the impact and the nature of the crime and the delays it takes sometimes to report them. The other barrier that we see, which I think is, maybe lesser known, is the way the law actually treats adolescent girls when it comes to sexual violence. So through our analysis of laws in the Americas, there's this crime called estupro in Latin America, but there are estupro-like crimes throughout the region. And estupro crimes describe situations in which adults have sexual relations with minors who are above the legal age of consent. So we're not talking about statutory rape, but we're talking about sexual violence of 14, 15, 16-year-olds. And these discriminatory laws often result from adults who have sexual intercourse with 14, 15, 16-year-olds as after means of seduction, deceit, often promises of marriage or promises of other things, which under an international model rape law would be defined as rape. And the problem here and the barrier to justice is often in the Americas, we see this being used to either mislabel rape cases, circumvent charges of rape, and really ignoring the exploitation of unequal power dynamics when it comes to adolescent girls, who can often be vulnerable for many reasons. And the problem really comes down to when it comes to holding perpetrators accountable, or really seeking justice for survivors who are of that age, because we see that it creates a hierarchy of sexual violence, and it also creates a standard of which victims we think are more deserving of justice, and really devaluing the lives of adolescent girls. So, for example, in Cuba, if an adolescent girl is raped, and the charge is a stupro, the penalty there is as low as 3 months. Whereas if it was to be what we would say the charge of rape, which it should fall under, the penalty is 4 to 10 years. So you have a matter of months versus a matter of years, and it just is embedded in the law that kind of adolescents is devalued by their governments. So this is an alarming barrier to justice that, in the sexual violence discourse is not talked about as much.
When we talk about the statute of limitations, Joy, I want to look a little bit deeper into this, because you're right. When we see somebody who's engaged, who's been violated, sometimes it does take a minute for a person to really get themselves mentally, emotionally ready to come forward and be able to bring those proceedings. As you talk about the battle, what kind of pushback are you receiving when it comes to statute of limitations?
Great question. So, a lot of the time it comes down to, lawmakers and governments saying you can't leave a crime open for indefinite period of time because due process, and the due process rights regarding this issue. And we definitely are the mindset that everyone deserves to have their rights upheld, human rights, due process rights, and all of that. But I think when it comes to sexual violence crimes, there's a lot of misconception around it, right? There's still this a lot of stereotypes that if it really was sexual violence and you really were traumatized by it, then why wouldn't you come forward, right? There is this misunderstanding of trauma and the impact it has, and also kind of the societal stigma that keeps a lot of survivors hesitant to come forward. And the law is not equipped to handle that reality. And I think a lot of pushback we get are from people who aren't educated on the fact that sexual violence trauma takes time, and there are a multitude of reasons why a victim may delay reporting. And it's not because what the law might say that it wasn't serious enough for them.
If you talk to us a little bit about communities that are actually affected by this, we see that many times the people that you are representing actually come from marginalized communities. Can you give me a little bit more about the demographics that you're seeing when you are representing these cases? Because many times the people who you're talking about come from these areas.
Sure. So we know globally, marginalized communities are more likely actually to be subject to sexual violence, and not only subject to sexual violence, but they also are more likely to have negative interactions with law enforcement, and with the justice systems that they come in contact with. And we know this is happening around the world, not just in the United States, though we know it happens at alarming rates in the United States, especially when it comes to people who, whether it's race or economic issues, they fall at intersections where the rates of injustice and the way that their cases are handled are alarming and concerning. But this also happens all over the world, like you said. So we've seen, indigenous women, for example, in all of North America, they're less likely to have their sexual violence cases even investigated by police. We are seeing women with disabilities who live in Eurasia. They often have their cases completely discounted because their particular accessibility needs aren't being met to continue a case. And in India, we work with a lot of women groups and survivors on the ground there who come from minority communities who face discrimination, based on both their caste, and their tribal ethnic identities. And yet we see that this group of women, or these groups of women, they face the highest rate of sexual violence in the country. So one of the, really important things that we embed in our recommendations is that any solutions really need to be intersectional, because right now we know the legal systems, they don't work equally for everyone, and they really need to, no matter your race, your ethnicity, your religion, where you're living, your disability, national or immigration status, caste, sexual orientation. I could go on. It needs to work for everybody, and we're seeing that it doesn't.
Yeah. I know that the work that you do is individual, but it's also collective. And you guys have been working together with many groups, collaborating really to bring awareness to this and then also to advocate on behalf of these victims. Can you give me a little bit of perspective on the collaboration, how you've been able to get your message out to other groups, organizations to bring this awareness so that way we can see some sort of action taken?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's a really big hallmark of how Equality Now works. So we like to say we work in interrelated pathways, and I talked a bit about how we work on the legal side and identifying the gaps and changes that need to be made. But a big part of how we work is with our global partners. We know we don't do anything without global partners and people on the ground actually saying, this is what we see, this is a change we need, and this is how we see it happening. And one of the things that we do is we really invest in our partnerships. Partnerships are mutual. We work both ways, and we are led by our partnerships on the ground. And what we do is we often bring groups together. So partners in one region, we bring in connection with another group, either in the region or globally, to really amplify international advocacy. And what we end up doing is, when we work in partnerships in this way, is we're able to harness the diversity of people working together around the world around a given legal issue or many legal issues. And we're able to capitalize or harness, the power of social media, mainstream outlets. We like to work with, influencers, activists, and artists on the ground, really to engage in many different ways with the public, with media, with governments, to raise awareness, change attitudes, which is a big part, and really why we want to work with a diverse group of partners around the world, to change attitudes and ultimately, gain support for the legislative and systemic change we want to make. So that's, we really encourage a diverse group of partnerships to work for, and we love to bring groups together to amplify collective messaging.
Give me a little bit about receptivity, right? Because as you're going about and you're making your case known for, you're being a voice for the voiceless. And as you're a voice for the voiceless, you're introducing some of the things that maybe many people are not so familiar with. As you're going about meeting groups, organizations, what is their reaction when you start to unpack a lot of the trauma and a lot of the barriers that these victims are actually facing?
Well, I think one of the benefits of what the lens we're able to bring to the table is when we get in touch with groups on the ground who are working in this area, and we know we're definitely not the first ones to, or the leaders in this space. There have been people, activists on the ground who have been working tireless at this for decades, and when we like to come in, we like to amplify what the messaging that they are taking forward. And the lens that we add to this discourse is really the backing of an international human rights framework. A lot of the times when we work with groups, they're working with sexual violence on the ground, trying to change local laws or bring awareness to other barriers on the ground. And they might not be aware that there's a lot of backing from the international community. Governments can be actually held accountable because of their obligations under international human rights law and in other international jurisprudence. And what we have seen is the ability to just amplify a message by bringing marrying the local advocacy with the international force that international law has, and being able to, and in many cases, I don't want to say validating, but in some cases, groups where they are able to amplify their message by using, this is not only a violation we're seeing individually and locally, but it's an obligation my government owes me because of international law. And we're able to bring that in and really add that added element to the messaging. And it does really, solidify that what they're seeing on the ground is a human rights violation. It's not just an individual violation that they feel, it's a human rights violation, and they have every right to hold their governments accountable for it.
So how does the public get involved to work and partner with the work that you're doing?
So, we encourage anyone to get involved with us. We always are looking to hear from anyone and everyone around the world to see how we can amplify our mutual messages. The first step I would say is feel free to go to our website. It's www.equalitynow.org. There's a tab that it's called Get Involved. So if you hit that tab, there's many ways to learn more. You can join our newsletter. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. We're on all of those social media platforms, and we are eager to get involved with you and for you to get involved with us and learn more.
And so as you're looking towards 2022, what are some of the things that maybe we should be keeping our eyes on, paying attention to as the year goes forward?
So Equality Now, we're going to continue our work. Our Ending Sexual Violence campaign is ever going. So we're going to be continuing to, look at laws, make recommendations. Again, if there's people who are listening today that would like to lend their voice to our advocacy, we'd love to get connected. We're going to be also looking more at intersectional issues, for example, with survivors with disabilities. We're expanding our work a lot in the Middle East and North Africa region, actually. So we're working with a lot of women's groups there. And we're also turning our attention to focusing on online sexual exploitation and abuse and formulating recommendations for governments on how to protect human rights in the digital space, which was ever evolving.
Yeah. Before we leave, I do want to get an opportunity for you to just share very quickly about that digital space, because there was something we left out. But give us what we're seeing in the digital space, because we know a lot is going on by way of trafficking. A lot is going on by way of communication. Talk to us about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I would definitely keep an eye out for that coming out from Equality Now in the future, because we are doing more work on that. Because online sexual exploitation, sexual violence, and trafficking, we are seeing the technology space and the digital world really posing new, complex, and ever evolving challenges. And as generations spend more and more time on the internet and have increased access to the digital world, which is a good thing, but it does come with a lot of risks of exploitation. And we're seeing that. We're seeing various forms of either whether it's grooming or facilitating exploitation and trafficking. And while the digital realm has exploded and taken is going to new heights all the time, the protections have not. So we really need to catch up and make sure that the same human rights that are protected outside the digital world are also protected online. And we need, governments to get involved with this too, to make sure that those who are, responsible for these online platforms are equally responsible or take responsibility in making sure that it's a safe space, especially for women and girls who are vulnerable to exploitation and sexual violence through the online media.
Yeah. Jorie, we're going to leave it there, but I want to thank you so much for joining us and being with us here on the Social Justice Forums. A lot of information to unpack and certainly a lot of information to follow. Hopefully we'll be able to get you back, give us an update as to how things are going and what progress is actually being made. But thank you for shedding light on a very important topic as we talk about Sexual Assault Awareness Month. That's this month, and you've brought to light a lot of helpful information. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Daren. Thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you. Jorie Dugan, our guest here on the Social Justice Forums. We want you to take a quick break. And when we come back, stay with us. We're coming right back with another guest. We'll be right back in a few. A group of Bronx merchants got together to address the overall increase in crime and the possible role of the new bail reform law, which went into effect in January 1st of 2020. Our BronxNet reporter Arlene Makoko gives us the details right now.
Murder right now is up 57%. Robberies are up, 70-something%.
They are merchants, community leaders, and residents, all alarmed in what they see as an overall increase in crime and the possible role the new bail reform law that went into effect January 1st of 2020 plays in this.
Those issues, our elderly being attacked. Our children can't even go to the corner store. So we really need to be addressing these issues vigorously and intelligently with an education and a health package.
Not just for the Bronx, but the entire city.
We have a video of him shooting my nephew. We have pictures of him, and the district attorney still hasn't picked him up.
In Spanish Harlem this past December, South Bronx community activist Awilda Cordero says her 18-year-old nephew, Matthew Rivera, died as a result of gun violence.
He went into a grocery store, and a young guy that was in there with a gun started arguing with his son. All he did was tell him, get out the store, don't do this here. He took him outside. When he went outside and turned around, the guy took out a gun and shot him.
Joined by members of the Yemeni American Alliance of Business that represents some 6,000 convenience stores across the city, Cordero blames the new bail reform law that eliminates cash bail for most misdemeanor and nonviolent felony charges, including stalking and assault without serious injury, select drug offenses, as well as some arson and robbery charges, while created to prevent those without resources from being detained before their trial. Critics charge it's hurting communities for this reason.
They're not giving the judges the right to make decisions of their own and say, this young man already did 2 crimes, he needs to stay in. They're not giving the judges that permission. The judges has no power when it comes to that. They have to let them go because of the bail reform.
Soon after the law went into effect, then Governor Cuomo amended the legislation, giving judges more say in individual cases. But with the continued increase in crime, Mayor Adams and Governor Hochul are pressing to see further changes. Also there in support, Alex Faid.
Everybody is scared to go to the shop in the market. Everybody is worried about his children to go to the school, is his family. And a lot of people got shot, got robbery. Some people, they got killed inside his business. So we are worried about it.
For BronxNet, this is Arlene Makoko.
And thank you, Arlene. And if you stay connected to us here at the Social Justice Forums, we'll continue to bring you more information as it continues to become available, as voices are coming forward in support and also of opposition of the bail reform bill, a hotly debated topic. And of course, we'll cover that here on the show. Now, let you know in other news, we've got friends, family, and colleagues who recently gathered together for the inauguration of the newly appointed District 16 council member, Althea Stevens. Our BronxNet reporter, Brittany Schuyler Albane, has more details, and she brings us this story right now.
Friends, family, and colleagues gathered at the Latino Pastoral Action Center for the inauguration of newly appointed District 16 council member Althea Stevens.
Today we are in full celebration of my city councilwoman Althea Stevens for the 16th district here in the Bronx, and I'm excited to be here with her.
Councilmember Stevens' friends and family applaud her for her resilience. As a single teen mom, Councilmember Stevens was told that she wouldn't make it. Rather than accepting defeat, she proved everyone wrong by being at the top of her class and spending over a decade in public service before being appointed council member.
You cannot tell her that she cannot do something. If she puts her mind to it, she will do it. She'll make sure that the voices of youth are always heard, and she will always make sure that her heart is in anything that she does.
Among all of her platforms, including building a healthier community, affordable housing, and safety, Councilmember Stevens is a major advocate for the youth. She aims to invest in the youth to ensure they have the resources they need to become positive and productive adults.
For too long, youth services wasn't and hasn't been valued or invested in, but that changes now.
Councilmember Stevens has a strong political team around her, but more importantly, she has a powerful support system around her, as her family is extremely proud of her work and hopes to see her thrive.
To see my sister up there leading it, with passion, with vigor, with power, it's just just simply inspiring.
Councilmember Althea Stevens has already laid the foundation for the exceptional work ahead. Reporting for BronxNet, Brittany Schuyler Albane.
And thank you, Brittany, and congratulations goes out to Councilmember Althea Stevens. Look, we have more show. We want you to stay with us. We'll continue with a little bit more here on the Social Justice Forums. And welcome back to the show. The Opportunity Agenda is a social justice communications lab that is working to advance the impact of the social justice community. Now, their work is deeply ingrained and intersectional and organized around three main initiatives, which are criminal justice, immigrants and opportunity, and economic opportunity, through which they further their commitments to racial justice, human rights, gender rights, and LGBTQ justice. Joining me now, we're pleased to have the president of the Opportunity Agenda, Ellen Buchman. And Ellen, thank you for joining us.
I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Daren.
Thank you. I'll start off with the question that, is pretty, well, I'll just ask it. Talk to me about social justice, and how do you define social justice?
Wow, great question, Daren. Let me just first say again, thank you. I want to uplift you and the program and your team for doing what you're doing, for being interested in expressing what social justice means. It's really important. We at the Opportunity Agenda believe in making sure that in order to achieve justice and equity for all, we need to be focused on the long-term conversations that are out there to move hearts and minds toward policy shifts. Because without moving hearts and minds, if we focus primarily on the news, and if we focus on telling the story that, let's just say, is the quote hot and sexy story du jour, we ain't gonna get there. We're not gonna come close. And so for us, it's really a question of realizing how we can best be and set the stage for the country that really is as good as its ideals. And as a matter of fact, Daren, I'm really proud to share this with you. Our team just finished late last year, and our board approved a new strategic plan toward the end of achieving social justice, in which we enunciate that all of the narrative work that we do to move hearts and minds toward policy change will be with the objective of making sure that we are doing all that we can to overcome white supremacist narratives that have overcome our country, have overcome our systems, and have overcome in many instances people's hearts and minds, because absent those stories that address white supremacy and the systems they're in, we're not going to get very far, as I shared with you.
Yeah, a lot of work to really unpack, and I'll start talking about a few issues, and then we'll go from there. But on the issue of criminal justice, right? We continue to hear criminal justice reform really needing to take place. We've seen some progress, still a lot of work to be done. From your perspective, give us a little bit of insight as to how you view criminal justice and the work that you do.
Yeah, well, thanks for the great question, Daren. You know, we see the justice system along with other systems, as I suggested before, in our country as being, I would just say, focused on an objective that not only is unjust, but that needs to be challenged. And so that's my initial response to you. We need to challenge a system that in our world incarcerates more than focuses on objectively making sure that folks who have either made error or conducted an injustice can be resuscitated and can be participants in our society in ways that, frankly, we believe everyone should have a shot to be. And our organization, as I shared before, works on changing hearts and minds. So our piece of that long arc toward justice, Daren, really goes to the sort of conversations that are happening in our society about the justice system, and what we as leaders and people within the social justice ecosystem are doing to talk about that. Right? And so, for example, we've released recently an updated version of what we call our criminal justice reform phrase guide, which gives people tips around things like, and it might sound basic to you and to me, but you know, folks that are watching the news might not think in these terms. Focused on things like dehumanizing language that we have to address and change. So, for example, if you are someone who has been incarcerated, you should be spoken about as though you are a human being first and not an inmate first, right? This is one of the subtle examples of the sort of things the Opportunity Agenda is really focused on doing, because we have learned through our work and over a lot of research that that kind of language and how we represent the system matters, and matters to the change that we are trying to see. Secondly, and I frankly, we could talk a lot about the defund the police movement. I, frankly believe in it. My organization supports thinking about how we can shift resources so that people get the sort of support that they need in nonviolent situations in particular and the like, and so that our country's go-to address those situations is not always with somebody who is armed, a police officer. Again, though, I bring this up, Daren, because it's an example of something that we just recently released a report on, so that we could share not only that efforts around reform in some instances around the country have worked, but that they're not enough, and that we need to really concentrate again on how we talk about what communities in fact need. And while policing is important in our country for some purposes, certainly not in all purposes, and to us at the Opportunity Agenda, it starts with a conversation that is more just.
Yeah, when we talk about defund the police, we can have a few moments just to go unpack that for a second, because we talk about that, as you say, it's really not about it is about taking resources and allocating them to certain areas. So if you had your ideal situation, knowing what you know about what's happening now, how would you like to see this allocation occur? What would you like to see funded?
Great question. As I said before, our report begins with the best way to counter problematic narratives and harmful narratives so that an affirmative vision can be seen first, is to first address aspirationally what we want to see happen, which is another way to answer your question, Daren. What we would like to see happen, for example, and I mentioned this a little bit before, are more solutions that include things like counselors and experts in particular situations that often arise domestically in families around the country, in which people might need mental health interventions first, as opposed to situations that sadly and many times tragically result in violence because of, in some cases, misuse of weapons. And so for us, one of the things, to answer your question, that the Opportunity Agenda would like to see, and again, this pertains to our piece of the work, which is the story that needs to be told about this, we would like to see rise to the surface. And this is again why I give you a lot of play, Daren, on your show, as to how the attention is given and the light shown upon solutions that are nonviolent. And again, I'll use the example of mental health experts being deployed to situations first, if a situation calls for that. I can think of a lot, and I'm sure you've seen with your own eyes as well, situations on the streets of New York City where people without homes, again, humanizing language, instead of automatically calling them homeless people, they are people without homes, are being addressed in some way for doing something on the street by an armed police officer, as opposed to a mental health professional, or as opposed to a social justice worker or warrior who is addressing our city's homeless situation, who could be deployed but isn't, because the go-to 911 call goes directly to deploying an armed officer. That's the kind of intervention we would really like to see. But also, and again, our work is to shine the light on the story that should be told about that as well.
Yeah, we're having conversations nowadays with that word critical race theory. A lot of it's come under debate. And I know for yourself, that's something that you and your organization are dealing with front and center, and have even come up with the critical race theory guide. Yeah. What exactly is this guide?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The attacks on, I could talk a lot about this, but I'm going to resist.
You got it. Go ahead.
Thanks, Daren. I'll just let you know that the attacks on the critical race theory itself are really, in our view, at the heart of what our organization is trying to achieve, which is upending white supremacy and the narratives that surround it. And the reason why I'm saying this to you, Daren, in response to this question, is because teaching, and I'll just say to law students, the critical race theory is not used in any other circumstance. So to allege that it is not only not truthful and wrong, but it's again to stretch the white supremacist base's use of this attack so that they promote fear instead of future. And you get people ginned up about it, which is again a tactic and not a solution whatsoever, regardless of what one believes. But anyway, we believe in making sure that kids in school and kids in elementary school, young people in law school and the like, are taught the truth about our country's history, are taught the truth about how our country was founded, are taught the truth about why our country enjoys what it does systemically, and that is primarily because of and for support for primarily white male property owners. That is what started the United States of America. And so to come at this, absent that lesson, just as one major example that is at the heart of it, is not truthful in our view. And it doesn't do justice to making sure that the premise that everyone in our country has a clear understanding of the roots of it is just unacceptable to us. And so what we did to provide support to partners like the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund that's litigating a lot of these cases, and to other social justice leaders, was to put out this guide around how we talk about this and how we talk about it from an anti-racist viewpoint so that truth could be taught, along with, as I said before, so that we reframe the discussion. Because as we saw during the last election cycle, Daren, and as we know, as it's being called out on Tucker Carlson and the like, to come at this as though the critical race theory is being taught in K through 12 classrooms, and to not respond first to that, and reframe it, doesn't do any good. So we are really starting there and making sure that that truth is told, not only about the subject matter, but about what in fact the critical race theory is.
Yeah, and so when we talk about the subject matter, when we talk about critical race theory, it seems as though many people are still unfamiliar with critical race theory, except for the fact of saying, I don't want it. And when you ask people sometimes, what don't you want? They can't even clearly articulate what it is that they don't want. And I mean, Ellen, for me, it's like a head scratcher, because here it is, you're rebuking something that really you have no knowledge of. And until it's actually unpacked, you really don't even have a clear understanding. And many times, even when it's unpacked, you don't have the clear understanding.
No, it's well said, Daren. I'll compare this to the conversation that often, rises around affirmative action policies. It's very similar in some respects. People, generally white people, who aren't familiar with the policy, think they know what it is, and often, not always, but often, they actually don't. An example, in many instances, and I've done a lot of work on this particular example as well, affirmative action policies, number one beneficiary are white women, has been white women. And when someone like me, when someone who looks like me brings that to their attention, they're like, oh, what do you mean by that? How come I didn't know that? And then that gives me an opening to say, well, there are disparities that white women face. This policy has helped to address them. It is often not discussed because this policy was started to address disparities that African Americans in our country for generations have faced due to being descendants of slaves and the like. And you also should know that living alongside them are white women who also face those same disparities. And lo and behold, this policy has actually successfully addressed those as well. When I have a chance to say those words to people, Daren, they, as you said, they scratch their head and they think about it some more. To me, it's a question of how do we make sure that that same kind of attention is given to the story about critical race theory, instead of, again, baiting people along and saying that it's a theory that promotes fear. Because instead of doing that, we believe in telling the truth, which is what this whole thing is about.
Right. Well, we know that another social justice issue is the area of economic inequality. There are too many people who are living beneath the poverty line. And I equate living beneath the poverty line, not just financially, but, socially. And, there's a lot that can be said about the economic inequality that goes on. But it is financial. But there's also so many other ways that people are living beneath the poverty line. Share with me a little bit about economic inequality. How's your organization tackling this matter, and what's being done?
I'm so glad you asked about this, and I agree with what you just said, Daren. It's about a lot. It's about a large majority of people in our country living paycheck to paycheck. It's about the lack of, again, as I said before, generational support. I don't even want to say wealth, but generational support for people economically that is enjoyed for the most part by white people and not people of color because of generations of disparities and the like. All kinds of things that I could say in support of what you just said. So thank you for that. Our organization right now has a couple of projects that we're really excited about. In addition to deploying narrative strategies around how we talk about these issues, we also deploy cultural strategies and the like. And as I'm sure you would agree, we are surrounded, how's the saying go, Daren? Culture will eat strategy for breakfast anytime.
Yeah.
We're surrounded by culture, and people take in a lot every single day on their TV or on social media that tells a particular story. And so what we did to address economic insecurity and how the story is told about poverty is through what we call our Power of Pop series, which is a research report series we just released. Really a terrific body of research that shows how, I'll just say it, bad a job TV does in depicting how people who live below the poverty line actually live. In many cases, our research reinforces that, but also shows that most shows don't even deal with it, right? And so people have, not surprisingly, I'll just say an inaccurate view. And then they see what they see on the street and they develop their own stereotypes as a result. So one of the things that our organization does is really take in what the culture is showing and develop recommendations around that for change. Again, we believe that stories that unfold can change and move hearts and minds, and then policy will follow that, and our culture and the narrative within it is a huge contributor to that.
I know you do work in terms of organizing, and when I say organizing, really imploring upon people the need to understand a little bit better through workshops and having the opportunity to have some training to give people a better understanding of what's going on and how things are going and how they can actually be accomplished through their help. So when it comes to workshops and training, how do you go about educating the masses and really giving them the much needed resources, Ellen, to really be able to be engaged in this? Because, you know, there's a lot of misinformation out there, right? And I think that when you talk about countering that misinformation, you got to get people to the table, you got to get them educated.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more, Daren. So one of the things that we are really aware of is that the organizations and the leaders within the social justice ecosystem, the racial justice ecosystem, are going to be best positioned to reach the people that are members of their organizations. Ellen Buchman is not in the best position to reach the members of Color of Change. However, I use that example to say that the leadership of Color of Change works with our organization, and there are many other examples of organizations and leaders with whom we work there, and they just popped into my head as one example, so that we can equip them with the sort of resources that I'm describing to you, the phrase guide, the resources for how to talk about racism, how to talk about the anti-Asian movement in our country, how to talk about the tough issues that people either often don't want to talk about or don't know how to talk about successfully, so that they can then take those resources to their members themselves. So that's point one. Point two, we offer signature work in our training. Zoom just, you look at your hair all day, sorry. And we are an organization that is well known for training cohorts of social justice leaders in the format of training to give them, as we say, the space and the place to practice making sure that the language that we're advising is actually comfortable in their mouths, right? And so we will work with leaders to do that. We have a communications institute in which we provide that support. We provide support to cultural leaders and artists in a retreat format in the Creative Change retreat, not to provide them with training, but a space and a place to actually come up with ideas that will make interventions in popular culture, like the TV show issue that I described to you. We bring together those artists and those people so that they can figure out, all right, how do we address those issues better so that we can get better representation as a result. And then finally, we try and make our research available to as many people that we possibly can. One of our, for example, most popular reports that was actually released in 2011, but is still, if I'm not mistaken, one of the most downloaded things on our website, is a report that shows the representation of Black men and boys in our culture and how it is stereotypical at best, and why hearts and minds could actually shift if that representation were improved upon. And so we really work hard to meet people where they are, and provide them with that picture and a set of recommendations, which I think makes the opportunity agenda stand out, because often you get like gloom and doom news from research reports without recommendations, and that's not how we roll. We believe in giving recommendations by way of support to readers, to leaders, to people in social movement spaces, so that they not only have that research, but also have recommendations for what to do with it.
Well, we got to leave it there, but I want to thank you so much for being with us here and sharing a little bit about the opportunity agenda. Now, for people who want more information, tell us, what do they do?
Thank you for the question so much. If people would like more information about Team TOA, as I like to say, the Opportunity Agenda can be reached at opportunityagenda.org. I'm Ellen Buchman, president of the Opportunity Agenda, and would love to be a resource to anyone. Y'all better come, because we have a lot to do toward achieving true social and racial justice. Thank you so much, Daren.
Ella, it's been great having you. I really appreciate the conversation, the much needed work that's going on in our community around the area of social justice, and you being able to bring to light and then also bring some solutions that we can possibly see in rectifying a lot of the social justice inequalities that so many people are dealing with. So Ellen, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. You have a great day, Daren. Take care.
You too. Ellen Buchman is the president of the Opportunity Agenda. We thank her for joining us here on the show. And yeah, we're at the end of the Social Justice Forums. Want to let you know that we are grateful for you being here watching with us. You can watch next week. We're going to continue to elevate the conversation, continue to have more dialogue as we talk about the inequities that so many people face. When you talk about social justice as a whole, as you know, it's defined in a multiplicity of different ways. You can talk about economics, you can talk about housing, we can talk about LGBTQ. There's so many different things that we unpack here at the show, and we're glad that you could watch. So if you want to come back next week, come on back. We'll have you another episode, some great guests, and more exciting information that will keep you armed as well as informed. I'm Daren Jaime here on the Social Justice Forum saying take care and God bless.